Otosh, I'll happy to introduce this distinguished panel, and you've been working for a couple of hours already, and I guess it was intense. It would be even more. We'll try to do that. So my name is Nataliya Gumenyuk. I'm the Ukrainian reporter, the head of independent Hromadske TV channel, and we have a really distinguished audience who is the Ambassador John Herbst, who is the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We also have Mr. Oleh Frolov, who is the deputy head of the Ukrainian Security Service in charge of cyber security and economic security, and as well Alexander Melnyk, who is representing a Razumkov center and is researching the methods and elements of the hybrid warfare and is the head of the Kinetic lead, and the I'll probably won't introduce them in Ukrainian. They know their names, but we'll build our discussion that way, that everybody would have a couple of minutes of the introduction. We had a question before that in this extremely distinguished audience. Most of us were following what is happening with the hybrid warfare, what was happening in Ukraine. So we do not start from the beginning. We do not start from the Russian invasion and anything like the occupation in Crimea. We are here and experts who would like to know what's new is on this front after the 5 years of the war, which was led against Ukraine, against any other countries. So probably I would ask John to start, and we are in particular interested, what are the new moves, what are the new tools, what are the new things we've seen within the last year, both in connection to the election and maybe even not, because, you know, this is hybrid, so it's not just about the elections, here in Ukraine and maybe in the region.
Okay. I think that the work of our election commission, the main conclusions were that Russian intervention in Ukraine during the pre-election period has remained massive. I mean, Russia's involvement in Ukraine has been large since Ukrainian independence and massive and extremely aggressive since 2014. And the other point is that we've seen nothing spectacularly new by way of tactics in this period. But what we have seen, which is very important, we have seen developments which are new. I would single out two. First, the incident at the Straits of Kerch represented a Kremlin escalation in its war against Ukraine, because for the first time, Kremlin military forces openly engaged Ukrainian military forces. They were not trying to hide the participation of the Russian military, and that was new. It was not directly related to the campaign because it was driven by the circumstances at the moment, meaning that Ukrainian ships trying to pass through the Straits of Kerch. But it's also true Ukrainian ships passed through the Straits of Kerch without incident in September of last year, and only in November did the Kremlin decide to escalate by attacking them. But that was something new, something important, and something which did not receive sufficient attention and a sufficiently strong response from the West. The second new thing, which again is not a new tactic, but it's an important new development, was the peculiar reception that the Kremlin provided to Mr. Boyko and Mr. Medvedchuk in Moscow shortly before the first round of the presidential elections. They invited them, they greeted them publicly. Boyko, from my mind, whom I've known for a long time, looked very uncomfortable in the pictures. And Medvedev, the prime minister of Russia, said, we'd just love to send more gas at a very nice price to Ukraine if you have the right leadership in Kyiv. That was very clearly an effort by the Kremlin to pull at least some voters in Ukraine, specifically in the east and a little bit in the south, in the direction of one candidate. It did not really succeed because we've seen one candidate nearly monopolize the votes from the east and the south, as well as from the rest of the country, and that candidate has endorsed the foreign policy of the current president of Ukraine by saying he would follow a similar course. So these were two very high-profile Kremlin interventions designed to help pull results in Ukraine in a pro-Moscow direction. But those efforts failed.
Oleh, so we are really curious to listen from the security service, and so give us some data. What should we know about, in particular, the last year? Отож, Олеже, скажіть нам, що...
So, Oleg, please tell us what has the Security Service of Ukraine found, discovered within the last year during this election campaign. Maybe that is something new that we would like to hear, where you succeeded, where you failed, and so on. Thank you. Thank you, the organizers, the Eurasia Center, Atlantic Council, and Viktor Yanukovych Foundation. You are doing very important things for the future of Ukraine. For any country of the world, the election process is a special factor. There's a certain window of opportunities for destructive influence from outside, especially when we are talking about the country which for more than 5 years is a subject of hybrid or object of hybrid war from Russian Federation. Russia continues to implement this scenario of crawling aggression, which covers the whole different spheres of Ukrainian life, economic, religious, political. We see now that the final objective of the hybrid war of Russian Federation against Ukraine is the change of political course of Ukraine. The main focus was made on information and cyberspaces. Also, the political and civil society organizations of pseudo-Ukrainian mode were used. Also, the same trends will be used during the future parliamentary elections. In the information sphere, because the information resources of Russian Federation are very toxic, but they are also blocked. The Russian special services introduced the tactic of creating Ukrainian internet resources. In the end of 2018, the Security Service of Ukraine found that the representatives of one company were buying the temporary access to the accounts of Ukrainian users of network, and they were disseminating the information that discredits Ukrainian authorities, and this also promoting the conflict between different groups of people. Also, we stopped the activity of networks of internet promoters that included the citizens of the southern and southeastern parts of Ukraine. Again, they were disseminating fake information that discredits Ukrainian authorities, which was needed for the special services of Russian Federation during the presidential elections in Ukraine. I would like to give you some examples of such actions. For example, the Security Service of Ukraine discovered about 400 accounts which were to be used during the election campaign in Ukraine. And these are in Twitter, in Facebook, in Google, in YouTube. That information was given to the administrators of these networks, and some of them were blocked. Also, back in February this year, there were several cyber attacks made at the information resources of the Central Election Campaign. That these were attacks on the internet, web page of the Central Election Committee. But thanks to the joint work of the Security Service, the National Police, and CEC, these attacks were localized. Another example, on the 29th of March this year, just on the eve of elections, of the first tour of elections, we registered the sending of phishing electronic letters to the addresses of the members of the Central Election Commission. And the information we have allows us to say that this virus was sent by the special services of Russian Federation. After decoding these viruses, we saw some comments in the program in Russian language. Also, we saw the use of public, organizations, of NGOs, pseudo-patriotic organizations. The Security Service of Ukraine in February this year localized the group, which was called Ukrainian People's Army, and their final objective was to seize the governmental buildings. And also, same year, we registered and localized the group which is called Gila Balaklava, which was used by the special services of Russian Federation and certain Dulsky, the agent of influence of Russian special services, and the final objective was to basically organize the coup d'etat in Ukraine. Thank you for attention. I would like to ask you several clarifying questions. Probably the audience also would have some questions. Could you explain how do you differentiate that there's an foreign outside Russian influence? There are some political battles taking place in Ukraine when it comes to disseminating some critical or anti-governmental information. Or you mentioned these accounts. How did you define that these are Russian special services? What were the criteria used by security service, and what happens to people once such agents are discovered? Unfortunately, the forms and methods of the Security Service of Ukraine are the top secret, but there are confidential. But in Vkontakte network, there was an account created, which was Maidan 3.0. We worked on this account for half a year, and a web page, photographs which were on this account are very patriotic. And the calls there, and there were about 300,000 followers there, subscribers, and they were calling to go to Maidan to take the armed weapons and to seize the power through force. And the administrator of this account was the citizen of Russian Federation with the nickname Moskva. Back in 2014, he was fighting on the territory of so-called DPL. Then he moved to Moscow and was used by Russian special services for this work. After we made this information public, he wrote at his account, thank you, Security Service of Ukraine, and Alexander, now I would like to ask you, everyone knows that Ukraine is in the center of everything. What can others learn from Ukraine, from what we've learned during the last year? Thank you. A few words on how the work was organized. For more than 6 months, a small team in Razumkov Center was monitoring the information space, both Russian and Ukrainian. If you look at the number of files I have in my computer, there are more than 100 of them, but out of them we selected some where we could see the Russian trace, and we were trying to identify what is part of hybrid war or what could be classified as interference into Ukrainian elections. I would like to thank the colleagues from the Ukrainian Security Service. We have partnership with them, and we also were cooperating fruitfully with the Ministry of Interior, with the National Security and Defense Council. So it wasn't very regular, but we were discussing everything we discovered with our colleagues, and what we have on the website, the Ukrainian Election Task Force, is some part of the information which is quite reliable. So a brief summary of the results of our work. The main factor of influence on Ukrainian elections is the armed conflict and the occupation of some of the territories of Ukraine. And this this gives more space for Russia to interfere. And also this could give a lesson to some post-Soviet countries where Russia is the manager of so-called hotspots. Ukraine is less vulnerable to Russian influence because of the history, language, and religion. Also, we call it kinetic interference, but from the very beginning we came to an agreement that Russia today turned everything into weapons. It's not just guns. Weapons is everything: language, money, religion, culture, and it would not be proper to talk just about military actions or subversion activities.
Прогнози, які будувалися на початку проекту, вони
The most pessimistic prognosis that we had did not come true, but this is not does not call for any optimism, because the Russian troops are at the border still, and the conflict in the so-called People's Republics are still smoldering, and we used this interference with the Ukrainian elections or Ukrainian voters. We have this as a continuous effort, it's a continuous phenomenon. Russian interference, we discussed it earlier. This is not confined to the time span of the election cycle. The incident in Kerch Strait, I would respectfully disagree with Ambassador Herbst. It wasn't planned for the election. It was aimed at the election. In September, previously there were no obstacle for the Ukrainian vessels. Was it related to the election or not? It's still an open question, but it was very close, and we have our grounds to believe so. And Putin doing his thing with the passports, that was also crafted in such a way that it coincided with the election, and they used this opportunity that was very opportunistic. And at the website we have lots of materials posted. I cannot discuss them all now, but here's the conclusion. Russia has not reached the goals that it originally set for itself, and that was explained by the timely response and awareness of such threats, and the concerted action of all the proper authorities and the civil society, for that matter.
I would like to look forward, in particular maybe to start again with John. You mentioned the attack in the Kerch Strait as something extremely significant. What are really we expecting? What we can speak with, if we speak about our international support and partners, in particular in the situation in the Azov Sea, where we see more or less an effective annexation of Azov Sea by Russia, and where we are looking at the next half year, because that's where the election campaign is still going. We were somehow prepared that the very important things would take place during the parliament campaign.
There's no question that from a strategic point of view, the most important thing that the Kremlin has done in the war over the past year now, it actually goes back to April of last year, is to try to suffocate economic activity in Donbass via naval activity in the Sea of Azov and the Straits of Kerch. The building of the bridge across the straits was a violation of international law. It was built in a way to make it harder for certain types of ships to get into the Sea of Azov, which makes it harder to export products from Mariupol and Berdyansk. Also, the stopping and searching of ships, Ukrainian and foreign, in the Sea of Azov is designed to make shipping from Berdyansk and Mariupol more expensive. And we know that the amount of exports and imports through those ports has dropped by at least 33, if not 50%, as a result. So the Kremlin is increasing economic pressure on the people of Ukraine who live in the east, which would seem to conflict with their alleged interest in helping them live better. I already criticized Western policy, both European and American, for its weak response to the Kremlin escalation in the straits, at the Straits of Kerch. I don't rule out additional measures from the West, but I think it would take time. One thing I did not mention is that as a result of that Kremlin provocation, some very serious intelligence flights took place, Western intelligence flights over that area. And similarly, we've seen an increase of the NATO naval presence in the eastern Black Sea, and that's a good thing. By those steps, we demonstrated to the Russian general staff that there is a strategic cost for such escalation. But again, it has not been sufficient. And we're working to see if we can get a more robust response.
Я додам до Олександра та пана Олександра і пана Олега.
I'd like to add to Alexander's comment. Devil is in detail, as we know, and we can see the Russia's operations, the proxy war is very targeted. There are things at the local level, regional level, messages targeted at specific communities and audiences. What is the lesson learned? What is the specific message? You mentioned phishing. You mentioned weaponizing the social networks, maybe some economic or other activities that you see as weaponized and related to other spheres. Thank you. I would like to say that in all the areas of Ukraine's life, we can see the Russian interference. This is not just information, this is also in the economy. For instance, we can see that, unfortunately, the highest investments in Ukraine still come from the Russian Federation. However, strange that may sound. How is this done? VTB, the Russian bank, back in 2013 funded Kiev underground. $500 million was the price. Through different financial schemes that was increased considerably, the investments. And now VTB are raising the issue or were paying this back or giving them the Kiev underground. And this is your proxy war, and there are plenty of such examples. Alexander? Here's your opportunity to get into more detail with the crème de la crème of your materials for those who haven't read them. But we'll come back to this idea after your presentation. Despite the fact that the NGOs love criticizing the authorities, this is not a matter of love. This is a matter of substance, and they provide some grounds for such criticism. But sometimes when we have to acknowledge, we never miss the opportunity. For example, we had that fruitful cooperation. We didn't cooperate with SBU, in general terms, but that was some case of cooperation of the civil society with the governmental bodies. We identified certain threatening incidents, like tourists from Russia. With the Russian Spring, tourists, quote, quote, we prepared some materials and we approached the National Defense and Security Council. They said, thank you very much for the signal. For the whistle blown, we have already plugged this hole. And another good example, less known and not so conventional, this is preventing Russian monitors in monitoring the Ukrainian election. We're still criticized by our international partners that this is against democracy and so forth, but we demonstrated also to our international partners two examples, two characters who were acting or posing imposters. There's this Russian fund, three-star general of the Russian army is as their chairperson, and another graduate of the KGB Academy. Back in early 90s, former KGB operative dispatching his people, his agents, to monitor the Ukrainian election. Can you imagine that? And there's another example when, say, we have the selective technique, the notorious organization S-14 in Ukraine. We try to analyze whether we can see the Russian footprint, the Russian trace there. There is no direct evidence, like we talk about following the money, but the Russian money coming in cash hardly traceable. And we found some very suspicious characters as leaders of that organization. We cannot prove that they work for FSB, but there were some traces of contacts. SBU, I don't know. You presented one of the investigations done by your students for connections. The Russian network, the Russian web of spies in all the corners of the world. I don't know whether your partners can see. There was such an investigation that was done by our situational center, and we saw about 640 Russian NGOs, non-governmental, presumably as the agents, frozen agents, till the end of 2013. They were waiting for the signal, and then they were all resuscitated and evoked to form the Russian vector and influence in public life of Ukraine, and also in different internet resources and so forth. And that was discussed in the previous panel. And the money matters Indeed, but with this kind of composition of our panelists, can you say we have the court system and other things? Can we say that there is a direct influence of a foreign power, Russia namely, as regards certain political parties and political figures, political leaders in Ukraine? Maybe no names should be mentioned, but Ambassador was referring to head of one party that visited Moscow openly at the beginning of our discussion. Indeed, we can see the agents of influence and Russian direct interference with all the spheres of Ukraine's life. I cannot share all the information. Let me clarify. Are there any cases, you can say that this is state secret and so forth, but are there any cases pointing to any facts during this campaign or the forthcoming one, the parliamentary one, when you say that certain political figures, certain political leaders, maybe groups of people, of course you look into some developments, and can you share some general evidence for this? Maybe it's too early, and we should do that after the parliamentary election. I can give you one example. During this presidential campaign, one of the Russian bloggers, quite well known, was transferring from his account in the Russian bank about $500, the equivalent for Ukrainian citizens to ask questions of the president of Ukraine. And that was at the pre-election stage. There are some criminal cases filed. We are investigating. That's direct interference in our book. Alexandra, have you come across anything of that kind? There are investigators. There are people entitled to do that professionally. I do not want to trespass on the disinformation ground because it's not my province. But the Russian information campaign was aimed at President Poroshenko personally. 70% of critical information was against Poroshenko personally. And I'm not against Poroshenko. I'm not in favor of him either. But they were beating one candidate, the incumbent president, at that. If it is not direct interference, then what it is? And I'm asking myself, was it in conformity with the Russian strategy that was described by Oleksiy Benedictov, editor-in-chief of Echo Moskvy? He said that the best candidate is Mr. Chaos for the Ukrainian presidential election. That was the strategy, but they made this mistake acting against Poroshenko personally. That wasn't in line with their overall strategy. In Russia, we say that they are masterminds, they're arch villains, but they make strategic mistakes with some tactical gains. We have to be even more alert. We should not be complacent because we pay with lives for every single mistake. We are not happy with our failure in the strategic prospects. And in this audience, we are always cautious about the facts. There are many monitoring vehicles. That was one sample, not to disseminate any unchecked information. But what we should expect, what are the biggest threats and challenges for the forthcoming month?
What we're expecting?
You're talking about the problems over the next couple of months, not the
Yes.
problems with the Rada elections. Is that correct?
I guess they are connected. I would rather still I see that the space would be kind of overblown, both with the European parliamentary elections, Ukrainian elections. So it's all together. It's all connected today.
There is a continuum of Kremlin intervention in Ukraine designed to persuade the government in Kiev, whoever that government is, to pursue Kremlin-friendly policies. That's their objective. And if they cannot persuade the government to do that, then their second option is as Oleksiy mentioned, Mr. Chaos. And they are failing thus far with both objectives. But we've seen the dangers that await Ukraine in the coming weeks. Mr. Putin has already sent his first challenge to President-elect Zelensky with the passport gambit. But Putin was unpleasantly surprised by Zelensky's dexterity in responding. Zelensky said to Putin, well, sure, give passports to anyone who wants to live in a society without free elections of the type we have in Ukraine and who wants to have no human rights, will take that Kremlin passport. And suddenly Mr. Putin looks stupid. And there you haven't really seen a response from the Kremlin because they weren't expecting a response from Zelensky that would put Putin back on his heels. I expect we will see additional provocations coming from Moscow because, of course, Mr. Zelensky does not have a great deal of experience in politics. So they're going to see if they can somehow shake him. Their first effort failed, they'll come up with additional efforts. We could see a sudden increase in the war in Donbass. Although I don't think we'll see an increase which involves openly Russian troops, because they don't want to make it easier for the United States and the EU to impose additional sanctions. I think we may see additional efforts in subversion. The Kremlin has not done very well in subverting into new parts of Ukraine. They had that big failure in Odessa and in Ukrainian Bessarabia back in the spring of 2015, thanks to the excellent efforts of the SBU. But we may see some efforts here. The Zelensky victory has also been a disinformation defeat for the Kremlin, because the anti-Semitic lie that the Kremlin has been promoting just took a major hit. But in response to that, we saw that very peculiar article by Sergei Glaziev worrying about efforts against ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine as a result of the victory of Mr. Zelensky. The Kremlin is having a hard time digesting the fact that before, the East was voting for candidates who did not want a pro-Western foreign policy. Now the East voted overwhelmingly for a candidate who has endorsed a pro-Western foreign policy. So this is another new problem for Kremlin strategists and Kremlin propagandists. So they will react to this, and the Glaziev response was a reaction, a rather stupid one, a rather primitive one. But Moscow has been agile about finding new points of vulnerability to address. So we had to be vigilant.
Sandra.
Ну, я хотів би додати ще чи нагадати.
I would like to remind also, yes, you mentioned that there was a lot against Poroshenko in information space, but one of the reasons we mentioned that one of the instruments of Russian influence was controlled escalation. One of the reasons why we had no large-scale escalation was because for Russians, this cost-benefit calculation showed that a too high price had to be paid for that. But also, if Kremlin was against Poroshenko, they didn't want to give him this quite powerful mobilization factor, because Poroshenko could demonstrate his qualities as commander-in-chief. What can we expect now? One of the key questions which we are concerned with is the possibility of Russian aggression, issuing Russian passports. And now the information is that, first of all, the representatives of law enforcement bodies of DPR receive them. Every militant will have a Russian passport now. So General Gerasimov said, and I will quote him, when he was talking about the new Russian strategy, he said that Russia has successfully developed such a method as humanitarian operation in Syria. When you hear the words of Putin, why he is issuing passports, the question is whether they prepare the humanitarian operation in Donbass. But you read that it's not beneficial for Russia to start aggression, but basically what Russia has been doing for these 5 years was not beneficial for Russia. It was beneficial for Putin and regime. And now maybe another strategic mistake will be made, the aggression, which is not good for Russia as the country, but it could be good for some internal processes. If they need some small war in which they win, Ukraine is ready for that. So basically this period before the parliamentary elections will be even more critical than what we have been observing for the last 6 months. I would like to add, for Russia, for Putin, definitely, and the progress of Poroshenko is good, but there's the failure of Poroshenko is good, but there's one other objective is parliamentary elections. And because Ukraine is parliamentary presidential republic, it is important for them to have pro-Russian forces in the parliament. Once pro-Russian political parties appear in the parliament, then this will be a different story, because then there will be an opportunity to change both the laws of Ukraine and the constitution of Ukraine. And that's very dangerous. To clarify the way and the how security service will work is what President Zelensky knows. But our question is, what's next? How will it work? What are the expectations of the security service of Ukraine? Because the head of the state will be changed, and he is working directly with the security service of Ukraine. Tell us at least something. Yes, that's quite a provocative question. I'd like to say that the security service of Ukraine and its activity has always been following the constitution and the laws of Ukraine, and this will continue. Now, the questions from the audience. Oleh Ivazovska from Opora Network. My very simple question. First, I believe you cannot be a little bit pregnant, and the society cannot be a little bit open or closed. It's about interference into elections. Either it had place or it didn't have place. Also, what you are talking about means that probably our hypothesis on what was the purpose of interference, what was it? Any specialist could say the hacker attack on the CEC website does not influence the process of calculations, because the calculation will take place even if the website isn't working for 10 days. My request is, please tell us, what was the task of the Russian Federation for this elections. The hacker attack didn't work. Everyone realized that candidate Boyko could not become the president. That wasn't the task of the Russian Federation. So what was their task based on your monitoring?
Again, I think Moscow had several aims. The grand aim, as I mentioned before, was to try to push Ukraine in a direction that its government in some form would be more sympathetic or amenable to Kremlin interests, and barring that to create some chaos here. But their specific aims under those general headings were, first, they wanted Poroshenko to lose so they could claim victory. That's point one. Point two, and I think this was the reason for the trip, that strange trip to Moscow to meet with Medvedev, was to increase the vote for the opposition bloc / Za Zhytya joint platform in the presidential elections to set things up for the Rada elections. That was a second objective. The third objective was, again, to present a picture of chaos in Ukraine, and of course they failed completely with that objective. Going forward, their big objectives remain the same. They really don't know quite what to make of Zelensky. I appear on Russian TV from time to time, and right after round one, and when Zelensky described Putin as an enemy of the Ukrainian people, they were stunned. They said, how can he say this? And I said, well, Putin is conducting a war against Ukraine. When you do that, you're an enemy of the Ukrainian people. But the point is that they have trouble calculating the impact in Ukraine of their own aggressive policies, which is why their policies are failing. Bottom line, Ukraine will face continued Kremlin aggression until Mr. Putin realizes that his policies are failing. I don't think he will be able to realize that until at least 6 months after the Rada elections. He is hoping that the Rada elections will move the Ukrainian political spectrum in his direction. He will be disappointed in that. And then it'll take him a few months to understand it, and then he has to make a tough decision. But there are people in Moscow, including people who have access to Mr. Putin, who understand that Moscow's policies in Ukraine for the last 5 years are failing.
Отож, якою була мета російського втручання?
So what was the aim of Russian interference? I believe that the final aim of Russian interference was, Mr. Ambassador said correctly, the first stage was during presidential elections. The next one will be parliamentary elections. What do they want for parliamentary elections? A few minutes ago, I said that Putin's task is very simple: to bring to power maximum number of pro-Russian political parties. I can repeat it again, that it's absolutely obvious that the aim of Russian interference was to create chaos. We looked at whether there will be an aim to support some candidate, and that is the chances of some pro-Russian candidate, were so small that Russia just rejected this idea. But what is the strategic goal of Russian policy? Ukraine is an existential threat for Putin's regime. Ukrainian model, if it is successful, will ruin the whole Russian model, and that's the main threat. The President-elect Zelensky made a strong statement when he said, addressing other countries, look at us, we managed to do it. And I believe that Putin heard it, and that will provoke even more serious aggression from them. It doesn't mean that we have to give up or retreat, but that explains the model of Ukraine, that the successful democratic Ukraine is the threat for Russia, and to ruin this model is the main objective. And the elections is a very good period when the level of this instability is naturally high, and it's a very good moment to interfere. Also, you can ask questions. Maria Nadrach, Liberty Radio, and my question is to you, Mr. Frolov, and it's on SU. We haven't heard, we heard about $500 and the blogger about white balaclava, and the question asked by Nataliya Gumenyuk is on a famous Ukrainian politician, Viktor Medvedchuk, who's the ally of Putin, and the security service gave the instructions to check what was his trip about to Moscow with Yuri Boyka. Then back in 2018, SBU's security service said that they investigate the relations with separatists. Are there any results, specific results of the checking of investigation of Viktor Medvedchuk? In security service, I am responsible for issues of cyber security and economic security. I don't have all the information about the activities of the security service of Ukraine, and unfortunately I cannot answer. Using this opportunity, I would like to mention one of our assumptions about Medvedchuk. There were some pieces of information in November. Yanukovych, almost everyone forgot about them, and then Yanukovych wrote something. There was one message, and the moderator pushed him to that several times when he was saying that there's an attempt on life of Medvedchuk being prepared. But then TASS gives the information that the informed sources in the security service of Russia, special services of Russia, say that there is such a threat. And then DPI and LPR sources also repeated that. Maybe there was some idea of organizing some attempt on life of Medvedchuk, or just was that the case? But why I talk about that? Probably that was done, ordered by Putin, and the people who understand Russian Kremlin policy, and they say that Putin is just sitting and waiting, and others are trying to guess what he might like. Poisoning Skripals is one of the examples. Putin once said that the traitor has to be then responsible, and then someone decided to do that and expected that Putin will appreciate that. And so that is probably the case. I will put the question another way. Everyone has own competence. Mr. Vasil Gritsak could not be here, but basically you are responsible for economic security. Have you investigated anything related to property or assets of Viktor Medvedchuk? Maybe you can give us some answer based on your competences. Luckily, unluckily, or luckily, I'm not a politician. I'm responsible only for certain work. And unfortunately, I cannot answer your question. Medvedchuk. to help my colleague. One of these instruments of kinetic influence on Ukrainian elections is prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners of war. I'm afraid that I'm not mistaken that Medvedchuk will be allowed to liberate our prisoners. This is the person who will not be in public policy, but in public politics, but that is the channel that Russian influence goes through. And not just money or oil, but influence. Andriy Institute of Liberalism. And the institute, there were about 500% of the presidential orders. When someone says that Putin ordered something, then the question is whether the orders are executed. But how many people were discovered? There are rumors among journalists that there are many loyal graduates of the former school of KGB. They are still in power in Ukraine. Have you discovered some of them during this election campaign? I can give you an example of Mr. Rubin, who left Ukraine already, but he sort of returned. He left Ukraine. This was quite an interesting case. The court didn't make a decision as to his further staying in detention. That's an example of Russian agents of influence. When this citizen goes to Donetsk, buys some weapons, and the security service of Ukraine documented how he puts this into the bus, how he crosses the contact line, and the final aim of that operation was the act of terrorism, and many agents, so-called agents of influence of Russia, their cases are in courts now, but there are courts, they make sentences, but could you tell us where are the gaps? We are talking about, for about a year, about different threats to the security of the country, but there are still some things happening. So where are the gaps? Maybe from your professional point of view, you would say how these cases had to be finalized. What do we lack? The security service of Ukraine acts in accordance with Ukrainian laws. And the criminal, the articles of the criminal code of Ukraine are very limited. So within these criminal articles, the security service is doing a lot of work. I cannot give you any data on the criminal cases. But, for example, investigating the criminal case of the murder of the security service employee, the executor of this murder is in detention facility and is waiting for the court.
Ми працюємо в рамках цих статей.
Дякую. Ваші запитання. So please, if you have questions.
The criminal offenses are identified by the criminal code, and we are guided by the criminal code of Ukraine. Now, are there any further questions? Or would you let me continue with my line of investigation? Okay, I see you. Yeah.
And I have a question to our colleague. You know that today is we see in the news of the meeting of Mr. Pompeo with Sergei Lavrov and Vladimir Putin. Could you comment on the results of this meeting? Is there any possibility of another grand barging that was already discussed and even written in the New Yorker magazine, and any proceedings on this?
The public readout from the meeting yesterday suggests that there was a full and frank discussion of the major issues that are separating Moscow and Washington. That's diplomatic speak for serious disagreement. This trip was generated, one, by the fact that we should be talking to Russians at senior levels. That's just normal business. And two, that there's probably going to be a meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin on the margins of the G20 meeting in coming weeks. So Pompeo and Lavrov have to meet to kind of prepare for that. I understand why Ukrainians are a little bit nervous when senior American and Russian officials get together. But we have not seen, either under Obama or under Trump, an American willingness to do a quote-unquote grand bargain which would sell out American interests in Ukraine and Ukrainian interests. The United States has a strong record, I think, of opposing Kremlin aggression by imposing sanctions on the Kremlin, by providing weapons and military assistance to Ukraine, and by speaking out against Kremlin aggression. And I don't think that's going to change. Although sometimes when President Putin and President Trump meet, President Trump speaks in very, very soft and peculiar terms.
Ваші запитання? Або ж я теж актуалізую. John, I'll definitely...
Let me specify.
We have a couple of actual questions, and I know it's becoming very political both in Ukraine and the United States. It's regarding the whole discussion connected to the possible visit of Mr. Giuliani here. But generally, I understand that's politics if we go to the details. But what are concerns and how we can get out of this situation, that the political situation in the US and in the Ukraine doesn't influence the Ukrainian-American relations? We speak in both, you understand the issue between Biden and Trump, and here there are issues between General Prosecutor Lutsenko and the others. So we understand there are different inner political issues, but which in the end spikes into this thing.
Okay, first I'd want to say that the charges or the complaints, whatever word you want to use, against our ambassador here, Maria Yovanovitch, and the embassy are without basis. She is a strong professional diplomat who would never get involved in any American political matters. And there's no evidence that she has, as opposed to wild charges. Two, it is very important that for Ukraine's interest and for American interest in Ukraine, that Ukraine be supported by the political elite in Washington, both Republicans and Democrats. Three, this whole question of alleged Ukrainian interference in the American political election of 2016 is unfortunate because this is a partisan American issue, and I don't think it serves Ukraine's interest to be involved in this. It needs support of both Republicans and Democrats. I think that President-elect Zelensky responded properly and skillfully to the request for a meeting here in Kyiv, and so there's not going to be such a meeting because that would play into the American partisan divide. And I think it's very much in Ukraine's interest that this issue go away, and I think it's also in America's interest that this issue go away.
Певно, Олександре, можливо, ви також додасте, не з точки зору теж, як ви бачите.
Alexandra, perhaps you can add to this, because these elements can be used for a proxy war, can be played with by Russia. It's her favorite toy to escalate some problems, to exaggerate, and so forth. From the very beginning of our project, we agreed that the mission of our project would be monitoring of external interference with the Ukrainian election, and that our team wouldn't deal with any Ukrainian housekeeping. But I should not discard your question. Here in Kiev, I am in position to say that the majority of our problems caused by ourselves. The general public are not aware of many things, like the incident with the ambassador of the United States and some not very or very incautious statements of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. This is to the detriment of the Ukrainian interests, like Ambassador said, more than a week of the Russian influence for that matter. Another thing that is worth mentioning here is this. When we analyze the best ways to counter any Russian attempts, the most important thing is resilience or resistance of the Ukrainian society, of the Ukrainian state. Because when we have our disagreements and our confrontation, that's the best thing, the most opportunistic for Russia. Russia are looking for any kind of loophole to interfere. Look on our relations with Hungary, our immediate neighbor, our other neighbor, Poland. Russia is very opportunistic. They sometimes do not even have to create such occasions, and the Hungarian Cultural Center and the arson there. The arson at this center would be irrelevant, would have been irrelevant pro-Russia without that language conflict. Now Russia, through €2,000 to the Polish nationalists to come there to set it on fire once and twice, and there was a German intermediary involved. It's our fault in on too many occasions. We waste our chance to gain some success. We have.
If you still would like to ask the questions, otherwise I would use this position. Okay, proszę.
Maxim Melnyk. I have a question to Oleh. In March this year, there was an article where they said that using the equipment for cybersecurity purposes, you intercept some talks among the competitors of the the opponents of the still incumbent president. But I wouldn't be an NSB operative just remain silent on such accusation, responding to such accusation. Would you do anything to the author of this article? Thank you very much for your question. I would like to say that the articles are a tissue of lies, but this is not a subject matter for this panel. But this can be initiated, provoked by the Russian Federation. I don't think that this audience is interested in such detail. If you have a question, we can discuss it in the wings of this event, in the backstage. If you would like to be forward-looking, what should we watch for? There were certain things mentioned, like VTB Bank or any other things that are not very public, that we are not aware of. as members of the public. Yes, Russia wants to destabilize the situation, to create havoc and chaos, and present Ukraine as a failed state, talking about the information campaign. But what is new? What is unexpected? Maybe some other aspects or contexts after the election in Ukraine, in the European Parliament, some political shifts, political race or campaigning in other jurisdictions. Anything that we failed to mention? John? Oleg, you were nodding to this. It's a very interesting question. The security services of Ukraine are monitoring all the security-related areas, information on the military, economics, faith, and we can see attempts to interfere everywhere, all over the place, with the governmental bodies, the political activities, and we can see some Russian posts that, some Russian funds to fund political parties, not from the offshore bases, havens, and we are very careful about such investigations. So we will do everything in our powers to prevent that. We have this opportunity in all the areas, but there are some areas that are more popular with the infringers or less popular, so we should be watchful. But what is most important, the funding, as you mentioned. Perhaps we are confused. What's the order of such figures, so the transfers in question? Or will you be watching that after the parliamentary election, during the parliamentary? Actually, we have some files and some procedures instituted for it is very difficult to trace it down to the Russian source. It's not done through the Russian banks, usually it's offshore, and the offshore can be also in some European jurisdiction. But the general trend and the information available and the actions carried out after the transfer in question point to the Russian source of such funds. Okay, let's wait for the particulars of this. I would like to come back to this point that I was offering. Russia is much more powerful as a military power, as an economic, but they are being destructive, and not just in Ukraine, but also in other jurisdictions. They are not unbeatable. The Kerch Strait incident, for instance, remember the discussions, the response of the society to the first proposal to prolong the martial law, and then was prolonged. It was prolonged to till the end of December, and there was this statement from Sergei Lavrov, the Foreign Minister of Russia, for the contact line and for the administrative border with the Crimea, and the different intelligence sources in Ukraine reported this provocation being prepared. But Russia had to miss the opportunity, because with a big-scale provocation that they would have been, when it's bigger than the Kerch Strait incident, then you have to have no other mode of operations, just the martial law. Of course, for the society, that would be a big disturbance indeed, but the Ukrainian society demonstrated that the election was critically important to us, and that was a deterrent in its own right. The Three recommendations I would like to offer very briefly. Monitor, analyze everything. Secondly, exchange the experience. As we said, what Russia does in Ukraine is not necessarily to be repeated in other countries, in this same country, but there are some things in common. But speaking, if not strategically, then conceptually at least, with the new procedures, introduce new opportunities for combating all the attempts in all imaginable spheres.
Okay.
Thanks. My question concerns NATO, and maybe Oleksiy, to you. In 2013-14, the protests were not about NATO. It was about the European Union. Russia's invasion wasn't about NATO, though it became a post-facto justification. In the presidential election, we didn't hear much Russian propaganda involving NATO. Do you see any possibility that the NATO issue could be inserted into the Rada campaign coming up?
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, I think it would be a big mistake if President-elect Zelensky would initiate a referendum on NATO. That certainly Russia will use, because according to the public opinion polls, as you see, the Ukrainian society, despite the overwhelming majority is pro-NATO, there is still a significant part, especially in these vulnerable regions like eastern and southern part of Ukraine, and definitely Russia will use this opportunity. I don't know whether the NATO integration is something that keeps Ukrainian awake in the middle of the night.
You have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. Tadas Volionis, Lithuanian Embassy. I wanted to ask if you did any analysis, how did Ukrainian elections influence Russian society? Because it looks like, you know, in Putin is looking more like Brezhnev more and more, and Ukraine is fresh and new and developing. And it's not that Russia can control totally its society. You know, they can try to meddle in our elections, in your elections. But how does situation in Ukraine impact Russia? Maybe any ideas, any clues? Thank you.
I think the first panel was an excellent question. Anecdote was told about the impact of Ukrainian election on the Russian society. Also, I read Russian media on a regular basis, and really it's just overwhelming with the information about Ukrainian elections. In the longer term, I do believe that, again, I repeat, if Ukraine is able and willing to present an alternative model for the Russian society, including the elections, either local or presidential elections. Again, I don't remember what is the number of Russian viewers of our presidential debates. I mean, it's enormous in Russia. Definitely it has an impact. It may not have like immediate impact, but in the longer term, I'm pretty sure that this is Ukrainian historical mission. Because if we are serious about changing Russia one day in a better way, that Ukraine is the strategic tool to do this. And talking about our victory over Russia, I don't think that we have invested as heavy. Of course, we need military and we need defense capabilities. But what we really need to invest in, I mean, this is like Ukraine, successful Ukraine. This is what is this our strategic weapon against Russia, but again, not to destroy Russia, but to help Russia, you know, to become a normal country one day.
У мене ще кілька хвилин. Все ж запитання до пана Олега знову.
I have a couple of questions, a couple of minutes to Oleh. Can you tell us how SBU would cooperate with a project called Mirotvorets, Peacekeeper? They seem to be inclined seem to be sympathetic with the SBU, and they are against the destructive elements, subversive elements. They posted some controversial materials, particularly some foreign journalists, some people with certain political preferences. Thank you. SBU is cooperating with a whole number of internet resources, mass media. We provide open source information, and we also receive some information in return, but we are not founders or investors or participants of this project. We do not reveal any information.
We are about to finish. There was this quite a general question on what we are looking at in the inner international context. So where are the other things, what we haven't discussed so far, we can look at, be concerned, be up, maybe?
First, I expect that the American policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, support, again, fighting Kremlin aggression, support for reform will continue. And I suspect as well, although with not as much confidence, that the same will be true within the EU. Although the EU's position, especially on sanctions, was in part the achievement of Chancellor Merkel, who of course will not remain on the scene that much longer. So that's something that needs to be watched. But I think at least for the near future, the next 6, 8, 12 months, that policy will continue. We've seen twice since 2016, brief periods, 6 months each, where Moscow was willing to negotiate with some seriousness with the United States regarding Donbass. First, from January to June of 2016, when Toria Nuland was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, and then from July of 17 until January of 18, when Kurt Volker had the responsibility. The Kremlin shut that down, hoping for a better political environment in Ukraine. They haven't got it after your presidential election. I've already suggested they will not have it after the parliamentary election. About a year from now, this reckoning will come, and we'll see if Moscow is willing again to negotiate with some seriousness about Donbass. I don't know the answer to that question. Thus far, Mr. Putin has been in denial about the failure of his policies in Ukraine, and so he could continue these policies. He could head in direction of greater escalation, but that would be required. That would be with great danger, I think, to his political project in Russia. So that, to me, is the real thing to watch. I mean, one, how your parliamentary elections play out, but again, I suspect they're not going to lead to an environment which makes it easier for Putin to have his way in Ukraine, and then Moscow's reaction to it.
So thanks a lot. Дуже вам дякуємо. Я думаю, що
Thank you very much. Indeed, there is a lot to watch, to specify, to detect and define. You also referred to some publications and certain materials that are available for a careful research and